I'm able to present Julie Moss, who is joining us today from Promises Behavioral Health. And she's going to be talking to us about the grateful brain. And I'm looking forward to it. Welcome, Julie. We're so glad that you're here with us today. And what a great topic to finish out the year. And what a great topic in the midst of a really stressful and busy holiday season. So I'm going to sit back and listen.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Mind Matters, the last Mind Matters for the year. As Karen said, my name is Julie Moss, and I work in clinical outreach for Promises Behavioral Health. But I'm also an LPC. And for those of you that are not familiar with Promises, we are a behavioral health company that oversees a few treatment facilities in Central Texas, specifically the Right Step and Promises Brazos Valley. And then we have a few other facilities kind of scattered throughout the country. And so for today's topic, we are going to be talking about gratitude. So I'm going to pull up my presentation. Let's see. Okay, here we go. All right. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. I'm assuming everyone can see that. So again, today we're going to be talking about the grateful brain. And for me, this topic is one that is just a very exciting topic that I'm very passionate about. Gratitude for me has had a pretty profound impact on my life. And so my hope for this presentation is that you all at least take away one thing that can help better your life. And so with that, we're going to jump straight in. So what is gratitude? So gratitude is basically the state of being grateful. It's the act of feeling, communicating appreciation for the people, circumstances, and even material possessions in our lives. Gratitude allows us to really cherish the present and focus on the abundance rather than the deprivation. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in the presentation. And so with this slide, I encourage anyone to put in the chat, what are you grateful for today? Kind of we'll get that party started. I'm going to switch gears really briefly and just touch a little bit on the brain versus the mind. And is it the same thing? And essentially it's not. The brain, as you know, is an organ made up of nearly 100 billion neurons, which is kind of wild to think about. But the mind is going to be more your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, how we process all of that. And for today's presentation, we're really going to focus more on the thoughts. And that is basically the way that we talk to ourselves, how we process your experiences and the world around you. And so I have this quote at the bottom from the Buddha that says that all that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become. And so the mind is everything. That piece of this quote really sticks out for me because as a therapist, I've always leaned towards kind of a cognitive behavioral approach. I feel like our thoughts are so powerful, for better or for worse. You know, I think that they can really propel us to do incredible things. But on the flip side, they can be really detrimental based on how negative that they are. So that's important just to keep in mind. So how do our thoughts and our mood and gratitude, how does that kind of all tie in together? So I have this point that says many of us have our inner critic. I feel like I should put all of us have an inner critic. For some, it's more strong and more present than others. For some individuals, unfortunately, that is the only kind of voice that's there. And in previous work that I've done with clients, those that have that kind of strong inner critic really take the standpoint that that serves them in a positive way. Some clients will say that it keeps them on their toes, keeps them aware, prevents them from making the same mistake twice. And so my question to you is, how strong is your inner critic? What does that look like? And how do you think it serves you? If you feel like it does serve you in a positive way, I would encourage you to challenge that belief. Because research basically shows that that inner critic does not push us towards positive change. So that being said, you know, we live in a world that teaches us to be grateful for more measurable skills, like how much money you make or what your role is in your company in terms of hierarchy. And we're really not taught to acknowledge and be grateful for things like kindness and vulnerability and generosity. So my question to you throughout this entire presentation is, what are you choosing to look at? So we often find ourselves thinking a lot about what we don't have. And in today's society, the comparison factor has really never been stronger. With technology, and you'll see I have the facade of social media, we're always being reminded of kind of what we should be, have, look like, things like that. The reason that I put the facade in parentheses there is because I'm sure all of you know that what we see on social media, while is depicted as kind of perfection, is not always as it is. But seeing those images, we can't help but kind of use that to compare ourselves to others in a more pathological way, as opposed to a way that really promotes us to succeed and strive for success. So as a society, we, safe to say, are more stressed than ever before and more unhappy as well. And for me, I can't help but think that technology and social media play a big piece in that, but that's a whole webinar in and of itself. So when we are kind of having these negative thoughts and focusing on what we don't have in our lives, it's dumping chemicals into our brain, such as cortisol. And for those of you that are not familiar with cortisol, it is our stress hormone. It's also our internal alarm system. It goes hand in hand with our fight, flight, or freeze response. The interesting thing is that cortisol is really only meant to last a very short amount of time. It's meant to protect you, get you out of a dangerous situation. Going back to kind of when we were cavemen, it's meant to ignite, get your blood flowing to be able to either run away from the saber-toothed tiger or fight against it. That being said, in today's society, with negative thinking, traits, and even with social media and being on our phones, our cortisol is in overdrive more than it should be. And research shows that leads to just a slew of problems like sleep issues, anxiety, depression, weight gain. So we really want to make sure that cortisol is kept in check and really only used when it's needed. So kind of a little bit about the research of gratitude. Just as kind of those negative thinking traits pump cortisol into our system, practicing gratitude really changes our limbic system, and that's the part of the brain where our emotions come from. So it actually produces feel-good hormones such as dopamine, oxytocin, that's our love hormone, and endorphins. And so the point of this slide is to really drive home the fact that words are powerful. What we say to ourselves really matters. And not only does it matter, but it matters on a neurological standpoint. There's connections happening in the brain, whether you're thinking positively or negatively, and our brain remembers these things and it stores it and it remembers. And the saying, the more you think it, the more you link it, aligns really well with that. So a little bit more about the research on gratitude. They have found that really the why is a really important piece in what changes the way the brain works. So there's the what of gratitude, and then there's the why of it. And so I have a few examples that say, I am grateful for this sunset because it reminds me of vacations when I was a kid. I am grateful I was able to attend this event because it shows I am focused on my self-care and mental health. And so for me, when I was starting to kind of practice this, the what, was usually pretty easy to find. But once I learned that the why was just as important, it really pushed me to kind of take that extra step and add a little bit more to my gratitude statement. So depending on kind of how you lean, either spiritually or religiously, there's some spiritual teachers that suggest the more we practice gratitude, the more the universe gives us to be grateful for. And there's a quote here on the left from Deepak Chopra that says, gratitude opens the door, the power, the wisdom, the creativity of the universe, and you open the door through gratitude. I'll tell you a little story about me and my move to Austin. Almost 9 years ago, I was trying to move here, and it took me a while. It was pretty hard. During that time, though, I was really steadfast in my gratitude practice. I had my journal and would enter things a few times a week. And I moved here without a place to live and without a job, and I knew 2 people. That being said, though, my move here was seamless and so easy. I ended up getting a wonderful job and a great place to live within a few weeks. And I cannot help but think that that was due to me putting that gratitude out in the universe and the universe kind of giving it back to me. So what are some additional benefits of gratitude? So on a mental and psychological level, it fosters more optimism, higher self-esteem and motivation, less anger, and reduced levels of stress and depression. On a physical level, it helps improve our sleep, reduces our blood pressure, strengthens our immune system, and gives us more energy. And I think on the social level, that's kind of what sticks out for me the most. It definitely can increase our empathy, our compassion. It can help improve our relationships and even cause us to be more willing to try something new. And I think on the empathy and the compassion piece, I feel like that's needed most in this world. So how do you practice gratitude? How do you kind of get started? I think the easiest and most obvious thing is to get a gratitude journal. If you've ever seen ones that are specifically for gratitude, it'll usually have a place to put the date with a few lines and maybe a quote every few pages, which is great. That being said, a notebook would work just fine. That's what I started out with. I keep it in my nightstand. I write a few things a few times a week before I go to bed, and that's just part of my practice. There's no wrong way, to do it. I would encourage you to enter dates because it's really cool to look back, years before and say like, gosh, like that's what I was dealing with at the time in my life. And I saw it through and I came out on the other side of it. And for that, I'm really grateful for. And so that would be kind of the biggest suggestion for me is just to get a gratitude journal and start writing stuff. I think another thing that we forget about is using gratitude as a coping skill. If any of you are familiar with Brene Brown, she's got a talk on Netflix that talks about foreboding joy and how gratitude can really be used in that moment to kind of combat the foreboding joy. And I think that goes along with, if you're experiencing anxiety or sadness, depression, or just in any moment of distress, taking that moment to acknowledge something you're grateful for either in the past or in the moment can really help bring you back to that present moment and help you kind of stay centered. So what if you can't find anything to be grateful for? My encouragement would be just to start small. What do you appreciate? Is there maybe a show that you love that makes you laugh? Do you maybe feel like your bed is the most comfortable place on earth? Do you have a beloved pet? Again, there's no wrong way. I think, if you were writing in your journal or just even acknowledging it, it doesn't always need to be this profound, deep statement. It can be kind of even the little things in our lives. And so the second little block talks about, are you in good health? And if you're not maybe in the best health, do you have two working arms and legs? Did you get a good night's sleep? Again, it really can be anything. So maybe there's three things that you take for granted, but you're thankful for. And for me, I think my good health is something that I am so grateful for, but I probably take it for granted that I can easily just get in and out of bed every day, and not everyone can. And then another one for me is my car. I think that I'm so grateful for the fact that I have a car, but I don't always take the time to kind of acknowledge how grateful I am about that. And then lastly, you could identify someone who has had a positive effect on your life. And if you want to take it a step further, letting them know how grateful you are that they exist. So just to kind of continue into practicing gratitude, it's really important to find the gratitude in the challenges that life throws our way. For me, I feel like that's where some real growth can really occur. It's not always an easy thing to do. I don't know if any of you have heard of Viktor Frankl, but he has a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he was an Austrian psychiatrist who was imprisoned in Auschwitz during World War II. And during his time there, he kind of came up with the notion that the individuals that lost meaning of their time there ended up not surviving. And so he went on to develop logotherapy and the idea that really finding meaning is the only reason, it's the reason that we exist. Logotherapy goes on to basically explain that it's about adapting an exemplary attitude in situations of unavoidable suffering. And so for him, in the concentration camps, he was still able to find meaning and gratitude from that experience. Another personal story for me, several years ago, I had to say goodbye to a pet of mine that I had had for almost 20 years. It was obviously and understandably heartbreaking. But during the time of that kind of initial grief, I did take a moment to really acknowledge that I was grateful for that experience, that I got to have this little cat for almost 20 years. Not everyone gets to have their pets for that long. And so I put this quote at the bottom that says, "How lucky am I to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard?" And that's from Winnie the Pooh, as you can see. So I'm going to switch gears just briefly to touch on self-love and self-compassion. And the reason that I throw this into this presentation kind of goes back to the initial slide that talks about what we say to ourselves matters. And self-compassion and self-love is basically how we talk to ourselves. And so we're going to tie it into gratitude in a few slides. But we're going to talk about what is self-love and self-compassion. Why is it important? What do they look like? And how do I improve on it? I am going to pause right there, though, just to see if anyone has any questions thus far. So I'm going to pull up the chat and see. Did anybody have any questions about what we've discussed so far? No? Okay. Let's see. Okay. So self-love and self-compassion leads to a more authentic sense of self. It allows us to accept our imperfections more, and we're human. We're going to have imperfections. The challenge of that being learning to not only accept them, but love ourselves despite them, because there's going to be things about ourselves that are just kind of the way that we are. It's part of who we are, and that doesn't make us good or bad. It just makes us human. Self-compassion also creates emotional resilience. And so it's the kind way that we respond to our suffering. And for those of you that are familiar with Brene Brown, I call her the queen of vulnerability research. Kristen Neff, I call her the queen of self-compassion research. She's done a ton of research on self-compassion. And what the research shows is that that inner critic does not push us towards positive change, but that more kind voice is the one that does. Kind of going back to some of the work that I've done with clients in the past, I have found that some of them really struggle with this. As a therapist and just as a human, I find that to be kind of sad and really unfortunate that they can't treat themselves in a kinder, more self-compassionate way. That being said, I think it's important to remember that self-compassion is not taught in schools. For most of us, it's not taught in the home. So it's not something that always comes easily to ourselves. And so before we beat ourselves up for not being able to show ourselves some self-compassion, it's important to remember that it's something that requires effort and practice. And so my question to you is, what does your self-compassionate voice sound like? Is it there? Is it strong? How have you incorporated this into your self-talk? So what are some tips on kind of how to better your self-compassionate voice? I think the easiest and most obvious thing is that it's going to sound like the way that you would speak to a friend or a loved one, treating yourself as you would treat a loved one. What I find kind of mind-blowing and fascinating is that we speak to ourselves, some of us speak to ourselves in ways that we would never dream of speaking to a friend or loved one. And so what's fascinating to me is that it's okay and permissible to speak to ourselves like that. And it's just a notion that I find really interesting. Gaining perspective, and that kind of, again, ties in the whole gratitude piece. Practicing forgiveness and acceptance, again, for your imperfections, and then implementing more self-care. So what does that look like? You know, I think a lot of us think of self-care as treating ourselves to something. And I read an article, I guess about a week ago, that talked about self-care not really being just taking a bubble bath or going to get a massage, but really also doing things that don't seem that enjoyable and don't seem that fun, but are going to put us on a better path. And so maybe it's making a spreadsheet to figure out your debt. Maybe it's getting a second job to help with your debt. And so that really kind of stuck out for me because I had never really considered self-care in that way. So how do we incorporate the self-compassion into our gratitude? So acknowledging gratitude for your individual strengths and attributes really ties in that self-love piece. So what is it about yourself that you're grateful for? Maybe you're a really hard worker. Maybe you're an amazing mom or good friend. How can you kind of acknowledge that when you go to write in your journal or when you go to make your gratitude statements for the day? And so an example that I have is, I'm grateful I tackled my anxiety yesterday because it shows I am courageous. And I feel like this can be really powerful into kind of bringing it all together. So, kind of went through this pretty quick, but just to conclude, again, self-compassion and gratitude is not something that we're kind of innately born with. It takes practice and it's like a muscle. And I firmly believe that the more you, excuse me, practice it and access it, the easier it is to access. You know, our minds are like muscles. We can make them stronger for better or for worse. And so I'm going to conclude with this quote that says, being thankful is not always experienced as a natural state of existence. We must work at it, akin to a type of strength training for the heart. And that concludes my presentation. What questions did you guys have? Looks like maybe somebody has one in the Q&A. Any suggestions on how to get my kid to use gratitude to help with anxiety? That is a good question. You know, if they were intervening on their anxiety, for me, that would be something to be grateful for. If they were taking the time to kind of combat that, that's something to be grateful for in and of itself. How often do you have to practice gratitude to see changes in the brain? So interestingly enough, there was one slide where there was a study, and I don't know how big the study was, but it reported that individuals who wrote a few things a day for a few times a week reported being happier than people that did it every day. That was interesting to me. You know, I don't know the research on kind of the frequency outside of that, but what I found is that it's not really an overt change that you kind of see drastically, but over time, you maybe just notice your perspective changing little by little as time goes on. Let's see. Okay. Did you say the self-compassion research? Yes, was Kristen Neff. So both of them, both her and Brene Brown teach or taught at UT. And I think maybe they both teach a class or two from time to time, but yes, Kristen Neff, Neff, yes. If somebody's read all of Brene Brown's books. Yeah, she's got a new one. She's amazing. Any thoughts for people living in domestic violence situations that has been going on for many years? Thoughts in regards to how they can implement more gratitude? I'm going to assume that's maybe what the attendee is asking. You know, that kind of goes back to finding gratitude despite our suffering, which again is obviously easier said than done. But I would encourage that individual to kind of dig deep and really see if there's one thing that they can be grateful for despite going through this really difficult situation. Let's see. Any other questions? Let me check the chat. So someone wrote, thinking about children and anxiety, could practices that move away from competition towards cooperation be helpful? Oh gosh, well, yeah, you know, kind of going back to the comparison factor, you know, comparing ourselves to others is not always a pathological thing. It can, like I said, promote us to succeed, to kind of strive to do better. But when it kind of runs into the gamut of causing us to feel not good about ourselves, that's when it can be more of a problem. Let's see. Do you have any other suggestions of gratitude prompts to get people thinking about ways to frame gratitude, not just what you are grateful for? Let me read that again. Do you have other suggestions of gratitude prompts to get people thinking about other ways to frame Gratitude. I'm not sure I understand that question well. I mean, I think generally speaking, kind of going back to what are you choosing to look at? And there's always going to be things about our lives that are less than or less ideal. And it's basically about which side of that do you feed? Which side do you kind of give more energy to? And so if it's not about maybe practicing gratitude, more just focusing on some of the things in your life that are going well. So I hope that answers that question. So someone wrote, self-care also involves resolving trauma from our childhoods. Oftentimes we don't know we have this trauma, and addressing things within ourselves that causes us to get burned out, like an overwhelming need to help people. I think self-care is a very misunderstood term in the mental health profession. Yeah, that's a good point. So Jody wrote, I was curious about explaining gratitude. I am grateful for ... because ... What are some typical whys that you have seen? I think the why is gonna be based on what the what is. So, for me, I am grateful that I was able to present on this because it's important to be able to share this information with other people. So again, like your why is going to be based on your what, and that's going to be different for every person. So some of the name of the books again. So Kristen Neff has a few books on self-compassion, if that's who you were referring to. Let's see. Oh, so someone had put a super simple prompt. What's right now? Oh, that's great. That's very present centered, and focuses on the here and the now, which technically is the only thing that exists. So someone put, we have to be mindful not to point others to gratitude without acknowledging the pain. That behavior can cause a feeling of not being heard and cause shame as they feel that they think wrong, especially in children. Feel the negative and understand the pain, then offer perspective. Thoughts, question mark. Yes, I totally agree. Acknowledging gratitude is not to invalidate any pain or suffering. My suggestion would be is that we can hold space for both. We can be sad about a loss or going through a tough time and still be able to kind of shift our focus on what is good, even if it's just temporarily. Can you address happiness versus gratitude? So gratitude is about expressing thanks, basically. Happiness is always, my understanding has always been something that kind of comes and goes based on different situations. My clients always struggle to feel happy rather than gratitude. Yeah, I mean, always trying to feel happy seems like an unattainable goal to me. There's some teachers that talk more about finding joy, and that's kind of more of a state of being rather than, again, happiness being kind of circumstantial, and gratitude can be an avenue toward obtaining joy. Any other questions? Just double check. Yeah, I think I got to everyone's questions. Oh, someone put, grateful for my new haircut that lifts my spirits. I love it. Grateful for supportive connections at work, at home, within my family, and in my community. It's great. Grateful for my health and my sweet 7-year-old niece. I love it. I'm grateful for my ESA and how he reminds me I'm loved no matter what. Grateful that I have a variety of support communities. I love it. I am grateful for having a job that really allows me to use my strengths, improve on areas of interest, and a boss who will acknowledge areas that are not my strongest and take those tasks off my plate. That's great. Grateful that I have a work schedule that's easy to work into my weekly schedule, tutoring. Grateful for my parents coming to spend the holidays with my family. I love it. Grateful for the ability to talk with friends and hear the way I talk to myself and how that needs to be more positive. Yeah, I mean, I would encourage all of you kind of moving forward to pay more attention to that inner voice and what does it sound like? Is it kind or is it not so kind? And how you can maybe reframe it if it's not so kind. Let's see. So someone has another question. For me, trauma causes any positive self-love, gratitude to tell myself I'm being prideful. Is there a way to reframe that? That's a good question. So I've had some clients who feel like acknowledging anything positive about themselves would mean that they're cocky or even narcissistic. And I would encourage you to challenge that notion. I think all of us, probably safe to say, can recognize if someone is being cocky and kind of full of themselves, as opposed to really taking the time to acknowledge the incredible things that you possess as a human being. And so kind of going back to that notion that it means that you're cocky or narcissistic, like safe to say that could be a core belief that's in us that's kind of reinforced through culture. And so challenging that core belief could hopefully help with that. Do you have any other published works around gratitude and anxiety? I don't think that I do at this time. So someone put, if I notice my inner voice being not so kind, I tell it to eat a Snickers and take a moment to just breathe. I love it. You know, sometimes it can be helpful to kind of personify or give that critic a identity in a sense. And that when it does pop up, yeah, I mean, how you kind of talk back to it can be really helpful as well. And that goes for anxiety too. But yeah, I love that. Eat a Snickers. Love it. Any other questions? Well, this was so great. I thank all of you for coming. I hope that this was helpful. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to send over my cell and email to Christina, and I'm happy to answer anything following up. And if anybody wants this presentation, I can email it to her as well.
Thank you so much, Julie. This was great. Again, I think so often, I just love the reminders, and you also offered some additional ways of thinking about gratitude that I hadn't thought about in a while. And so that was really helpful. And I have to say, I love Kristen's last comment. Love that. Tell my inner voice to go eat a Snickers, and I just love that, being reminded of the power of just naming things. So thank you for that. And yes, I do want to remind everyone that, Julie, if you are comfortable sharing your slide deck, then I know Christina is really good again about getting the recording on our website. And then I think that she's able in her follow-up email to also send additional resources or the PDF of the slide deck as well. Yeah. So if you have any additional resources, like any of the book titles or things like that, then she can certainly add that as well. So she just put in there, the recordings and materials are going to be available at NAMIcentralTX.org under Mind Matters. So what a wonderful way to finish off our year, just rooting ourselves in gratitude, both the challenge and the grace of it all, right? So we're grateful for you for helping us finish out this year. And I just want to remind you, we'll be back. In fact, I'll be back on January 13th so that we can look at kicking off our year with some alternative ways, again, of looking at how we manage our mental health, both at home and at work. Looking forward to that. Wishing you all the happiest and safest of holidays. Take care, be well. Grateful for all of you. I loved seeing some of the comments in there. I saw someone posted how grateful they were for us in the support that we provide. And we're glad that we're here for you as you're navigating both your own and the mental health of your families. So take care and be well.